Everybody. Today we're going to talk about public health advocacy and social movements. This class will help you to apply the principles of leadership, governance, and management, to apply negotiation and mediation skills to address organizational or community challenges, and to understand the role that advocacy and social movements have in the policymaking process. Effective advocacy happens in social movements. And in social movements, the population becomes educated. They start to know what is happening around a particular issue. They become alerted to what's going on. They are mobilized to take action, and they become willing to challenge the power holders to demand change. The downside is that this can take many years to happen. Social movements affect change, but usually not immediate change. So when we talk about social movements, we have to talk about power differentials first. And there are two ways to look at power. So one is looking at the power elite, the folks who hold power through their dominant control of the state, the institutions, the laws, the myths, the traditions, the social norms. These are folks heavily engaged in the political system, heavily engaged in our economic system, the very wealthy, the very influential. Like most folks with power, they use this power first for their own good, and often it's to the disadvantage of society. And the power in a power elite model flows from the power holders down to the people. But the power of those in charge of our elites in science and industry and technology, in the media, in the arts, in politics, in a democracy, it's dependent upon the cooperation, acquiescence, and support of the mass public. So if you think about the power flow, it's we, the people, who partake in creating and supporting these norms and institutions and laws. So what do power holders do in a system where you have power elites both supported by and versus people power? Power holders want to maintain the status quo because it's serving them. So if there's an issue that's going to cause trouble or upset the status quo, first they want to keep it out of sight. Let's keep it out of sight. Let's keep it off the table. And both political parties do this. Democrats do this. Republicans do this. They want to control information. They want to deny the issue exists, or create myths around the issue, or make the issue sound threatening. They will seek to discredit the opposition. When pushed to the wall, when the population starts to get alerted, they will appear to take action, maybe make some minor reforms, and they will try to co-opt the opposition and bring them in. Well, what do social movements do? Social movements organize the people. People power only works when the people are organized. So the task of a social movement is to uphold generally held societal values and to point out how they're being violated. So a social movement is going to keep the issue in the spotlight. It's going to counter myths about the issue. And this is really important, and it's something that we've lost sight of. A social movement should really avoid focus on electoral or partisan politics. So if there's an issue that has the support of some Republicans and some Democrats, and it's generally an issue that Democrats would support, it's a mistake to refuse the support of those Republicans, because it's about, in a social movement, about fixing the problem, but fixing the issue. Social movements organize and mobilize people. They refuse to compromise too soon, so they're not going to accept a token change. They'll support grassroots action, and they reject and resist co-option by the power holders. So what powers social movements, right? Because social movements are primarily made up of people organizing together, and those folks typically don't have a lot of money or a lot of power as individuals. But the source of the power of human social movements really lies in our human qualities. It's powered by a strong sense of right and wrong. Most of us have truly deeply held beliefs and values. And once we realize these values have been violated, we're going to react with indignation, with passion, with determination to make it right. And also through symbolism. We as humans, we understand the world and reality in large part through symbolism. So social movements harness our sense of right and wrong and communicate to us through symbolism. Now, there's a way of thinking about social movements that was originally developed by Bill Moyer, who's one of the grandparents, if you will, of social movements in the 20th and 20th century. And there's some documents attached to this lecture that you can also view, but I'm going to take you through the 8 stages, and I'm going to use the rise of the Black Lives Matters movement as an illustration of those stages. Now keep in mind that Bill Moyer's Movement Action Plan, or MAP, is a model. And like every other model we've discussed, it's a simplification of reality. So it's not going to capture every bit, and it's not going to be perfect, but it gives us a structured way to think about it. So the 8 stages of social movements, and we'll go through each one. First, there's normal times. Then something happens, a bad event happens. It shows the failure of official institutions. Maybe multiple bad events happen. The conditions become ripe within society due to the social movement for change. The movement takes off. Just when the movement's taking off, the people who are organizing the movement will often perceive that they failed, and yet majority public opinion is shifting towards them. There's success, but success doesn't mean that it's over. Most social movements will build on their success and continue the struggle for further action. So let's start with normal times, right? In normal times, conditions exist that violate widely held values in the community, but the majority of people aren't aware. They don't know the nature or frequency of such events, and the majority of people feel comfortable with official explanations. So prior to 2013, racial disparities in policing and police violence are not in the mind and awareness of most of the public, even though they exist, and they're quite striking. And we can look at the data, certainly from prior to 2013, and see serious inequities in the arrest rates, the conviction rates, the level of injury and death caused by police to Black people, particularly Black men, versus whites. But prior to 2013, the majority of the population is not thinking about this. It's normal times. And then in 2013, George Zimmerman, who's not a policeman, and this is an important point that folks miss, he's part of a neighborhood watch group. He murders a teenager named Trayvon Martin, and he's acquitted of that murder. The treatment of the case by the police from the beginning, and the treatment of this case, the murder of a young Black man, by somebody acting as an armed neighborhood watch person, starts to bring awareness to the public. There's some activism, there's some demonstrations for Trayvon Martin, but there's no substantive policy changes. In 2014, 3 Black women get together, and they start, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They start an online social movement, #Black Lives Matter. And it really started almost as an internal movement, so they had a space to talk with themselves and people they knew, but it took off. So what happens then? So the next step is proving the failure of existing institutions. So activists have to demonstrate a problem exists, because in order to activate the general public, who's generally sleeping, they need to be outraged, right? Their sense of right and wrong needs to be violated. So you have to show a problem exists, you have to conduct research, and then utilize available opportunities, political, legal, media, demonstrations, to highlight and publicize the issue. So in 2014, the deaths of unarmed Black people at the hands of police get more media and public attention. Now remember, these deaths have been happening prior to 2013, but now they're getting media attention. Now there are demonstrations. So Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice are 3 of the most notable victims whose whose stories got a lot of attention in the media. Many of the initial Black Lives Matter protests center around Ferguson, Mississippi, where Michael Brown was killed. And then in 2015, the Washington Post starts tracking every single fatal shooting by an on-duty police officer. So this brings attention, and very middle-class, middle-of-the-road attention to the issue to a much wider population. Brings attention to people who are not activists, to people of all different ethnic groups who were fairly indifferent before or didn't really think about the issue or accepted the official explanations of the issue. So then stage 3, right? Ripening conditions. So again, it's 2015. This can be a slow-moving process. And the frustrating thing about social movements for many people, for especially advocates, is how long it can take. How long it can take from the first documentation of the problem to a real solution can be years, can be 5 years, can be 10 years. In the case of tobacco smoking and smoking cessation, it took about 25 years. So in any case, it's a slow-moving process, but growing numbers of people become discontent with the status quo as more and more information is publicized. People stop relying on established organizations to affect change because they see it's not happening, and new small autonomous local action groups begin to form. So we see this in the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2015, there were more deaths of Black people at the hands of police or in police custody. So receive media and public attention. So in 2015, notable are Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland. So then protests start erupting in multiple cities globally, actually, and towns after each incident and the subsequent court decisions, because in none of the cases in 2015, no officers were convicted of anything. Most weren't even charged with anything. The few attempts to charge officers resulted in acquittal. Occasionally, a police officer or local police leader lost their jobs, but that wasn't common. So multiple cities, these are multiracial protests. The general population is very much engaged. Local Black Lives Matter groups start to form around the US and, like I said, globally. And then the Black Lives Movement really takes off. And in general, a new social movement seems like it's bursting into the spotlight. But the reality is there are people who've been doing the work of building that movement for years before most of us see it. This bursting onto the scene is usually propelled by a shocking or a graphic trigger incident, and that incident will be followed by more, largely but not entirely, nonviolent action campaigns. So there's marches, there's rallies, there's blockades. So the Black Lives Matter movement really takes off, really goes global in 2020. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd is murdered by Officer Derek Chauvin, who pinned George Floyd to the ground until he suffocated and died. And he was also murdered by the 3 other officers who helped to hold George Floyd down or prevented bystanders from helping. Their names are Officers Quang, Thao, and Lane. This touches off because this was caught on video and widely shared media. Touches off what some call the largest protest movement in U.S. history. More protests and actions erupt in multiple cities and towns. Over 2,000 cities and towns in all 50 states in the U.S. saw some form of protest. I don't know what the count is globally, but there were media accounts from all over the world. What's important to note, though, this didn't randomly happen in 2020. The Black Lives Matter movement had its roots in the 2013 establishment of it and the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement over the years from 2013 to 2020. But the graphic event happens, the entire population is now aware of the problem, the protests are massive, so an interesting thing happens in a social movement. Just when a movement is on the brink of huge success, it starts to feel like they're failing. Why? Because the power holders fight back. They dig in, they resist change. Many activists have been working on this for, an issue for years. They'll burn out, they'll be all kinds of internal bickering in a movement. Early victories don't typically happen. Most social movements take sustained effort over 5, 10, 15, 20 years to make a difference. Now, ironically, this perception of failure happens right before things flip to a big success. But let's take a look at some challenges to the Black Lives Matter movement at this point. So in 2019 and 2020, George Floyd is murdered by Officer Chauvin and the other 3 officers. But the authorities, the power holders, don't want to do anything about it. You know, all kinds of things about George Floyd's backstory come out, which are irrelevant to how he was brutalized by the police officer. But the activists don't give up. Long time, lot of attention. There's finally legal action. Defund the police becomes this very popular slogan. It affects the 2020 elections. In some places, it helps folks get elected. In other places, it keeps folks from getting elected. Several cities attempt this, defunding the police, but they later roll it back. And that feels like a failure to the Black Lives Matter movement. And then there's questions arising about how the BLM movement is handling its finances, how it's managing itself. Again, power holders will attack the organization, will do whatever they can to hold on to the status quo. And then also dispiriting at the time, but remember, everything takes time, and we're seeing convictions from the January 6th riot. But there were immediate differences in how the January 6th riot, which was mostly white folks, and the BLM demonstrations were handled. And the BLM demonstrations were ethnically mixed, but it's predominantly a Black movement. And these are seen as further evidence of persistent racism. So then what happens? So there's a tipping point at which public opinion flips. And remember, it's people power that shifts the dynamic, that shifts change, because ultimately in a democracy, the elites derive a lot of their power from the people. So there's now this grassroots struggle with the power holders. The movement itself, Black Lives Matter, wins a larger backing of a larger proportion of the public, and the movement will utilize all available means to educate the public. Tactics often change. So let's look at what happened with Black Lives Matter. Now remember, this is a model, so some of these stages cross each other a little bit. So the citizenry is becoming activated from 2013, but things really take off in 2020. People who would not normally be activated, who would not normally demonstrate or do anything, again, tapped into that outrage, the sense of right and wrong. A Black man is murdered on video by a police officer, and we all see it, and it's offensive, it's horrendous. So people who become activated that wouldn't normally be. So, and they may be activated by writing Facebook posts, by tweeting, by writing letters. Some join protests. Taking a knee at sports events started with Colin Kaepernick, but it quickly spread, and high schoolers were doing this. Black Lives Matter also focused on removing statues and other symbols of racism and white power. And majority opinion was really more and more swinging towards their viewpoint. So success. So there are a lot of large-scale achievements of the Black Lives Matter movement. So in general, when a social movement hits success, it reaches a new plateau. And that doesn't mean they're done. But public opinion turns the tide against the power holders. And then the power holders are forced to make real change, not token or symbolic change. And usually significant goals are achieved. It's be unusual for all the goals to be achieved. But if we look at Black Lives Matter, their large-scale achievements, many cities, including Richmond, Virginia, and New York City, take down Confederate monuments and other troubling monuments, such as Marion Sims. That started happening in 2018. In New York, which is a more progressive city, Richmond's not particularly progressive, but by 2020, they were taking down their monuments. And at this point in Richmond on Monument Street, all of the Confederate monuments are down. In 2022, all 4 officers involved in the death of George Floyd were tried, convicted, and received jail time. That was new. No other police officer prior to this had been convicted, and certainly nobody received jail time. President Trump signed an executive order to create a federal database of decertified and terminated police officers so that a police officer who was terminated in one place for abusive behavior, racist behavior, could not simply go to another police district and apply, that there was a way to check on them. And 30 states made a change to allowable police tactics. Some states created laws giving police officers a duty to intervene if another officer was being violent. A number of states banned neck restraints. So there were some really significant victories. So what happens then, right? The movement doesn't give up because there's more work to be done. So the success attained in stage 7 should be celebrated, but it's not the end of a struggle. The particular campaign is typically part of a wider struggle for what we can think of as a sustainable participatory democracy. But at this point, it takes a little refocus, right? The movement and the individuals need to refocus and renew, and then new groups may come up to focus on unfinished business. So some new goals. Certainly there's criminal justice reform goals. The 8 Can't Wait proposals, which are seeking changes to police departments. Seeking changes in school curricula and advancing racial equity in many sectors beyond the criminal justice sector, seeking to reduce maternal and infant mortality in Black women and children, to increase homeownership, wealth, opportunities, and employment. And there's pushback to these things. So the cycle starts again. And that is how a social movement grows and continues to grow. So where do you fit in? So the next part is going to talk about Bill Moyers and how he conceptualized the 4 different roles that people can play when they're thinking about participating in a social movement. So Bill Moyer identifies these 4 roles, and I'll go over each of them. All 4 roles are needed. He refers to one of the roles as citizens. By citizens, he means regular, everyday people. I change that to citizens/residents because not everyone in the United States is a citizen, and yet we all can play a part in social movements. We need reformers, we need change agents, and we need rebels. And so here's what the roles look like. Citizens, residents, everyday people. They locate their actions squarely in society's mainstream. They are actually one of the main targets of a social movement because we want to activate the citizenry. Sometimes these folks don't even realize they've crossed the line from passive citizenship or civic engagement to activism. Most people really hold a vision of that the U.S. is a democratic good society. But one of the values of having citizens involved are their numbers, the fact they vote, many of them. Having ordinary people, citizens or residents, it demonstrates that they support social change. It gives a social movement legitimacy when everyday people are behind it. It makes it harder for the authorities to discredit the movement because the everyday people are adding their people power. And it also reduces the potential for violent attitudes and actions on the part of the power holders. What do rebels do? Now, rebels have fun. They build the conflict. They help focus society's attention on the problem. And they're also very serious, but rebels are intense. They put the issue on the social and political agenda through dramatic nonviolent actions. Think demonstrations, think blocking traffic, think media stunts, think anything where you get the attention of the public. They uncover how institutions and official authorities have violated the public's trust. They show how institutions and official authorities are causing and perpetuating critical social problems. And rebels are very in our faces. They force us to face our problems, and they promote democracy. What about change agents? So rebels are really important, but then you need people and organizations to kind of gather up the citizens together and help direct all that energy. So change agents will support the involvement of a large number of people in the process of addressing social problems. Not everybody who goes to a demonstration is a rebel. A rebel is organizing the demonstration. A rebel is leading it. Change agents are gathering everyday people to come be part of it. They promote a new social and political majority consensus to favor solutions. So change agents encourage the population to vote on issues, encourage the population to contact their representatives. They support the development of coalitions. Change agents are basically about building the groups that do the work of social action. They counter the actions of authorities. They come out with information that challenges the authorities, and they move society from reform to social change. They're playing the long game. They're seeking a paradigm shift. And what about reformers? Reformers, in Bill Moyer's language, are the professionals who are taking all of that energy that the rebels generate, all of that outrage and indignation that regular people are now feeling, all of those suggestions and ideas and solutions that the change agents have come up with. And these reformers transmit these analyses to the authorities through legal efforts. They advocate, they lobby, they bring lawsuits, they write legislation and ask congressional representatives to sponsor it. They act as a watchdog to ensure, remember we talked about policy, to make sure laws and policies are actually implemented. And this role is often played by professionals and advocacy organizations because it takes a lot of specialized training. I'm not going to read through this slide in detail, but as you're thinking about the role that you yourself might want to play, there are effective and ineffective ways to perform each of these roles, and I really like the way that this particular slide lays it out, so I will leave you to peruse that at your leisure. And do you have to be one of those roles? So one thing to remember is you don't, but these roles, again, they're models, and models are simplifications of realities. These roles are not personalities as such. Some people may be more inherently suited to be a rebel, but anybody can do it if they're outraged enough. Any one person or organization may play multiple combinations of these roles. Some people are oriented towards one or the other, but ideally when you're working with others as part of a larger social movement, people and the organizations understand their role and respect the roles of others. And so I'll leave you with questions to ponder. And I'd suggest you talk about this with your group. Which role do you prefer? Which roles do others in your group prefer? And how do you see yourself taking action in the future?